It's probably pop-ups first and then auto-playing video as a close second. It's horrible. So to think that of pages that include video on them, more than half of them autoplay the video is just astounding to me. Hey everybody, Darcy Burk here with Burk Digital Factory to talk to you today about HTTP Archive's new 2020 Web Almanac, what they call their annual State of the Web report. And the purpose of this report is to better understand how the web is evolving, what new technologies are being utilized, what feature adoptions are trending up, trending down, and basically just get an understanding of the state of the web. So right from their own documentation, how they did this, they're using web page test, Lighthouse under the hood, and they're gathering all this information and putting it in a public BigQuery dataset using August 2020 data as the basis for their analysis. So what I'm going to do today is highlight a point or two from 15 of the 22 chapters in the Web Almanac so that you can get a quick summary of some of the most important takeaways and findings from the study. So the very first section in the Web Almanac is about page content, and the first chapter is about CSS. So one really neat point I took away from the chapter about CSS is that the median page uses the exclamation important declaration in nearly 2% of all CSS declarations, or 1 in 50, basically. So the important declaration, basically the purpose of that is to declare in CSS that this CSS code should override and supersede any other CSS code that might be conflicting with it. And that can cause a lot of problems. So misusing the important declaration can really wreak havoc on a website CSS. And it's interesting to see 1 in 50 are using it. And the biggest reason why people use important, as found in the Web Almanac, is the utilization of display none. So trying to force hide some sort of a HTML element using CSS. Chapter 2 is on JavaScript. And what they found was that 83.5% of all mobile pages use a JavaScript library or framework with at least one known security vulnerability. That's just crazy to me. The vast majority of pages are utilizing JavaScript frameworks that potentially have a risk of getting your site hacked. It really shows the wide adoption of JavaScript, but the potential risks that can come up with neglecting and not maintaining proper version control for your different scripts and plugins and libraries that you use. Chapter 3 in the Web Almanac was about markup. And a neat piece that I took away was that 25% of pages don't have a fav icon set. And that's pretty funny because it's usually, back in the old school website HTML days, it was always one of the first things that I would do when creating a web page is setting the fav icon. And the reason why that's even more surprising to me today is that a couple years ago, maybe less than 2 years ago, Google implemented fav icons in search results. So you can actually see the fav icon of a website or a web page show up in search. So for 25% of pages not to have a fav icon really shows a missed opportunity for potentially being able to get a click from search results. So if you're a business that your website does not use a fav icon, it takes 2 seconds, get one generated, upload it to your site, reference it in your HTML, start using a fav icon today. Chapter 4 is on fonts. And what they found is that 25% of all pages use, the most popular font is Open Sans. Roboto comes in at number 2 with 23%, and Lato comes in at number 3 at 11%. So if you're interested in trying to decide what font to use for your website, always try and pick one that is sans serif, easily readable, and it seems like Open Sans, Roboto, and Lato would be pretty good choices if you're trying to pick one for your site. Chapter 6 is about third parties and linking externally to third-party services or scripts and things like that. And they found that the median website has about 24 third-party script requests. Seems like a lot. The reliance on third-party scripts for analytics, advertising, other sorts of tracking, debugging, all sorts of things. It's amazing how much we rely on third-party sources to help make our website successful instead of self-hosting and referencing these things. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's just when it comes to speed and performance, you really need to consider all of these third-party scripts and pretty much every reference to a file or a script on your website, and really ask yourself is this critical to my page and user experience? And if it's not, potentially get rid of it or find an alternative way and use it only on pages where it is important. You have to be very critical about what scripts you load in on your site. Part 2 or section 2 of the Web Almanac is all about user experience, and chapter 7 is about SEO. So I'm going to take a few more points and takeaways from this one to share with you, given that I'm kind of more interested in this subject matter. So a couple of neat data points. They found that 64% of pages utilize an H1, but 57% actually had text in them. So fairly low adoption for an H1 tag. Something that, has been debated over the years, how important it is for a site to actually, from an SEO standpoint, to have a keyword-rich H1 tag. I'm not going to suggest that it's going to be a game changer to do, but it's certainly a good idea. Google looks at the biggest and boldest title, typically the H1, on a page to help understand what that page is about. So if you're not utilizing an H1 on your site today, it's a pretty simple missed opportunity to go in and rectify and improve on your site. They found that 48% of pages utilize structured data. More than half of the web is not utilizing structured data to help search engines better understand their content. Now, very recently, it's been debated a lot about what kind of structured data Google actually cares about. Google has documentation about very specific types of structured data that they certainly do care about. Things like recipe structured data, products, reviews, FAQs. They definitely have solid documentation on the structured data they do care about. But there's so much more structured data than just those items identified in their documentation. And it's now very actively being debated if Google actually cares about that stuff. I have to think that having structured data to help search engines better understand their content in any form should be helpful in some way or another. Generally, my recommendation around structured data would be focus on the types that Google explicitly says, yes, we use these. Yes, these are helpful, mostly because they generate rich results. And then prioritize adding other structured data that can help search engines better understand your content, a little lower than maybe some other tasks in your SEO schedule, but definitely don't leave them out completely. They found that 99% of pages use a title tag. Great. The median character count of a title tag is around 38, so, fairly short. They found that 68% of pages use a meta description, which is much lower than I thought it would be. Your meta description essentially controls that snippet that appears in search results right below the title of your page. So it's a very important attribute to have filled out, even though a lot of the time Google will write their own based off of page content. Still good to have a solid, meaningful meta description. They also found that the median page has 20 images on it, which to me seems like a heck of a lot. Again, every time I think about any of these metrics, my mind goes back to speed, performance, and the core web vitals. And what do you need 20 images to communicate about your product or service, unless you're like a graphic designer or an interior designer or something where your product or service is very, very visual. I just feel like 20 images on a median page just seems like a lot. And from an accessibility side, they found that 11% of images didn't have alt attributes. Again, something that's helpful for accessibility and something that's also helpful for SEO and helping Google understand those images. So when it comes to some information around the core web vitals in SEO, of the websites in Canada, 31% of them scored good on the core web vitals assessment. So that's a good sign. About a third of sites are meeting that benchmark. Definitely a long way to go for the other 2/3. Good to see that Canada was about the middle of the pack for optimized core web vitals scores. HTTPS is something that's extremely important. Google has said that it is a ranking factor and does give you a slight ranking boost if you are utilizing HTTPS. It's a very negative thing if you're not utilizing it. Browsers like Chrome will flag your site as not safe. You won't get that little green lock that appears in the URL, the address bar on Safari on your phone, or Chrome or Firefox. You don't get that little trust icon. So it's interesting to see that about 77% of desktop pages and 73% of mobile pages have used HTTPS. That's up 10% year over year, but we got to see those numbers boosted up into the high 80s and 90s. It's just required in today's landscape. And then another last piece on SEO, usage of AMP. This is Google's HTML framework for having super fast loading websites served through Google's cache. The Web Almanac found that less than 1% of sites have AMP alternatives, which seems so low to me, given that news sites today require that you have AMP in order to show up in Google's news carousels. That's changing, but in today's world, that is the case. So it seems like a super low number of AMP utilization across the web. I was a big fan of AMP when it originally came out and did utilize it some. I found that although the speed improvements are significant, there's a lot of conversion and branding issues that come with utilizing AMP. So I've backed away from it mostly. Where I still use it a lot today is on blogs. So I might not have an entire website have an AMP alternate, but most of the time this blog section of the site I still utilize AMP for. Chapter 8 in the user experience section is about accessibility. This stat completely blew me away. They found that of the pages with video, 56% of those videos were autoplaying. Think about that for a second. When was the last time you went to a page and there was a video that autoplayed and you were happy about it? If you had your sound on, the first thing you do is scramble to try and mute that video or scramble to close the tab or browser. Nobody likes autoplaying video. It's probably pop-ups first and then autoplaying video as a close second. It's horrible. So to think that of pages that include video on them, more than half of them autoplay the video is just astounding to me. If you are putting video on your website, the only time it should ever play is if a user clicks on it or hovers over it if it's intentional, but a user interaction is required to play a video. Do not autoplay video, especially if it has sound. Chapter 9 is about performance. And I took a few stats around some core web vital metrics specific to Canadian websites. So in their analysis, they found that 53% of Canadian sites had an LCP, and LCP stands for largest contentful paint. Basically what that means is how long it takes for the biggest element on the page to be visible, whether that's a background image or some text or whatever it is. What is the biggest element on the page and how long does it take for that to show up? 53% of pages in Canada passed that test. 33% were a little below the benchmark and need improvement, and 13% were flagged as poor. One interesting thing that I took away from that data set is they started to expand and talk a little bit more about internet connection speed and how internet connection speed can affect, obviously, how fast sites load. But something that's been bugging me after reading that has been if the benchmarks for Core Web Vitals, how long it takes for the largest contentful paint to load, is that impacted by the internet connection? So if your users generally have a faster internet connection, are you more likely to pass the core web vitals test? And if so, then sites or businesses that are in countries with underdeveloped internet architecture, are they at a disadvantage because in general their customers connect with slower internet and therefore they need to do more optimization or do less on their website in order to pass that benchmark? A lot of questions I have around that. So I plan on joining the next Google Hangout and posing that question. So I'll either update this video right now or post a new video about it. Chapter 10 is about privacy. What they found was that 93% of sites use some sort of tracker. 60% of those trackers are advertising related. So no matter what site you're on, you're pretty much getting tracked somehow, some way, whether it's for analytics or the majority of time for advertising. If you're not using incognito mode or some sort of plugin to disable cookies and trackers, you're being tracked. Don't always think of it necessarily as a bad thing, but just know that every web page you're on, you're getting tracked in some sort of a way, again, whether it's from analytics or from advertising. Chapter 11 was on security. Now, this one's really interesting, really important. They found that 37% of total web traffic is generated from bots, and 24% of those bots are malicious bots. Not a good state from a spam standpoint and a security standpoint. So you got to keep your if you're using WordPress, your versions up to date. You got to use some sort of tools to help prevent against spam. Things like reCAPTCHA on your forms. If you want to stop getting form leads that are spam, only 10% of sites use reCAPTCHA. It's a free service from Google, easy to install on your forms. Highly recommended if you're getting inundated with spam. Chapter 12 in the user experience section is about mobile. It's interesting that 58% of all sessions online are mobile. Only 42% of time spent online is on mobile devices. We're using our mobile devices to access websites more frequently, but we're spending less time on our mobile devices than we are desktop, which makes a lot of sense. Smaller, more research-based things, we do quickly and easily on our phones, but when we really need to dig in and maybe make purchase decisions or larger research decisions, usually we resort to the desktop or laptop for that. Now the last chapter, chapter 14, in the user experience section is about PWAs, or progressive web apps. What they're finding in the Web Almanac is that less than 1% of all sites utilize PWAs. So although they're very popular and a trendy topic, they're being used just as much as AMP. The next section's a short one. The only chapter I'm going to cover is chapter 15 on CMS, or content management systems. And they found that 42% of the web uses a CMS, and 31% of all CMSs are WordPress. So WordPress really has a massive market share of the internet. Tons and tons of websites. The vast majority of websites that use a CMS are using WordPress. And of the top 5 CMSs, Wix grew its market share by 41% to 1.28% in 2020. So again, just Wix, who's in the top 5 and grew a whole bunch, only has 1 or 2%, whereas WordPress is sitting at 31%. So massive market share for WordPress, but nice to see Wix growing. I'm becoming more and more of a fan of platforms like Wix, Squarespace, Shopify. I used to really not like them for a number of reasons. One, I'm not a fan of not having full control over my source files and not being able to edit any line of code I wanted to. And 2, they just weren't well optimized from an SEO standpoint. The first point still exists. It's a problem for me, but it's not a problem for small businesses that are trying to get a website up and running. So I can empathize with that. And number 2, the concerns around SEO don't really exist as much anymore. So a lot of improvements made on these platforms. I now have a client that's using Squarespace, and I'm pleasantly surprised by the amount of things that I can do from an SEO standpoint. And the next section is content distribution, chapter 18 being about page weight. And they found that the median size of a web page is 1 megabyte with a median of 74 HTTP requests, with images being the largest contributor in both those categories. That's pretty good. Google suggests that your pages be 500K or less, which is really hard to do. Definitely some opportunity there to crunch those numbers down and get your website and web pages under 500K. The only problem is those numbers are growing year over year. So watch out. If you're adding content to your website, ask yourself, is this enhancing the user experience? Or is this just making the site look pretty for no reason? Gotta be critical about the content you're adding to your website. Every script, every image, everything you add to your website makes it larger and potentially slower. All right, and the last chapter, chapter 22, is on HTTP2. They found that the adoption rate for HTTP2 is 64%. It's pretty good. And that is increased 10% year over year, which is awesome. That's all leading to a faster, more secure web. And one of the reasons for the growth and adoption rate is the growing population of CDNs, especially CDNs like Cloudflare. I've been dabbling a lot into using Cloudflare to help with speed improvements in Core Web Vitals. So glad to see that utilization of those techniques is trending up. So that's my summary of the 2020 Web Almanac. Some really neat takeaways there. Things like, the vast amount of auto-playing video, a third of traffic being bots, and a good chunk of those being malicious bots. Really cool stuff. I'm really happy to see the community coming together and creating this awesome content. Really hope that it continues. If you have any questions about any of the content that I covered today, any of the topics, any of the points, please feel free to reach out to me. Check out our website at burkdigitalfactory.com. Subscribe to our newsletter. Follow us on Twitter. Thank you so much. We'll see you again.